In a world full of secrets, some are buried deeper than others. This is the story of a young girl who believed she had found the love of her life. A man who told the world he survived a nightmare. And a crime so carefully staged, that it fooled an entire nation. Before sunrise, sometime after 4 in the morning on a quiet day in mid-May, emergency services in Athens received a call unlike any they had ever heard. A man whispered for help through layers of duct tape. His words unclear, his panic unmistakable. He said armed intruders had broken in. He said his wife wasn't moving. He said their infant daughter had been in the room the whole time. Static. A deep breath. Then, what first appeared to be a tragic home invasion, would soon unravel into one of the most shocking and deceptive cases in modern Greek history. You are watching Buried Secret Media, where we uncover the truth behind the stories the world thought it understood. If you want more powerful investigations like this one, please remember to like, comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us keep uncovering the secrets buried beneath the headlines. Now, let's go back to where the deception began. The morning light had barely touched the rooftops of Glyka Nera, a quiet suburb on the edge of Athens. But inside one two-story home, a scene was unfolding that would soon dominate national news. Police officers rushed through the front gate, responding to the distressed, muffled call from the husband, a 20-something helicopter pilot named Babis Anagnostopoulos. They found the door unlocked. The interior scattered. Furniture overturned. Drawers pulled out. A scene that looked like chaos, and fear. At first glance, the inside of the home resembled a violent robbery. But as investigators moved deeper into the house, they began to sense something different, something that didn't quite fit. Upstairs, they found the husband bound and blindfolded, struggling to breathe through taped layers across his face. Nearby lay his wife, a 19-year-old woman named Caroline. Their baby daughter sat close to her mother, confused, crying, and reaching for her. The husband told police he had been tied up. He told them strangers had broken in. He told them he woke up to horror and could do nothing to save the woman he loved. The country believed him. Reporters repeated his words. Neighbors comforted him. Even police bowed their heads in sympathy. But buried beneath this tragic scene, was a truth waiting to be uncovered. Before all of this, before the headlines, before the speculation, there was simply Caroline Crouch. A girl born in early July of the early 2000s, to parents who adored her. She grew up on the island of Alonissos, surrounded by turquoise waters and quiet, sun-kissed afternoons. Her childhood was gentle, simple, filled with good grades, close friends, and a love for the sea. Caroline was athletic, intelligent, and free-spirited. She loved scuba diving. She loved long swims. Her life, by all accounts, was peaceful. But everything changed when a 27-year-old helicopter pilot vacationed on her island. His name was Babis. Handsome. Confident. Well-spoken. Older, much older, than Caroline, who was still a teenager in high school. He began showing up where she was. He charmed her parents. He charmed her teachers. And he charmed Caroline, a girl still forming her view of the world, drawn in by a romantic narrative that seemed like something out of a movie. For Caroline, this wasn't just a crush. It felt like destiny. She told friends she was in love. And slowly, she began picturing a future with him, a future far away from the island she had grown up on. The pilot's profession and maturity captivated her. He flew helicopters, traveled the world, and lived in places most teenagers only saw online. Caroline believed she had found the love story many young girls dream about. But as we would later learn, not all fairy tales remain beautiful once the curtain is pulled back. After a whirlwind romance, the couple eloped. No grand wedding. No traditional Greek celebration. Just two people stepping away from everyone they knew and creating a world of their own, one that, in hindsight, may have been designed that way. They married overseas in mid-July of 2019. Caroline left behind her island life. She left behind her childhood home. And she moved into a house in Athens with a man nearly a dozen years older. At first, their social media pages painted the picture of a perfect family, smiling photos. Beautiful locations. A new baby girl. A life that seemed joyful and full. But real life? Real life was not so simple. Behind the filtered images was a relationship full of turbulence. Arguments. Control. Isolation. Caroline kept a personal diary, and in it, she questioned her happiness over and over again. She doubted her marriage. She doubted the future. She wrote that she loved Babis deeply, but something didn't feel right. Her words were raw, honest, painful, and they showed a side of the story the public never saw. In her diary, Caroline wrote that she sometimes wanted to leave, but felt trapped by love, by circumstance, and later, by motherhood. As investigators pieced together the timeline, the events of that early May night became central. According to the husband, the couple had been asleep when masked intruders broke in. He claimed they were overpowered. He claimed the robbers wanted money. He claimed they tied him up, silenced Caroline, and fled into the night. The public reacted with outrage and heartbreak. Newspapers described the crime as inhuman and soulless. People demanded justice for the young mother whose life had been cut short. But as days passed, something subtle began to trouble detectives. Little inconsistencies. Small details that didn't match. Moments in the timeline that didn't align. Things no one else noticed. Things only trained investigators would question. The kind of details that crack a lie, even one crafted with precision. But at this early stage in the investigation, police kept those doubts to themselves. To the public, and to the world, the husband was a victim. A man who had lost everything. A man whose grief seemed impossible to fake. People sent donations. Businesses offered help. Neighbors embraced him. The country mourned with him. For more than a month, everyone believed the same story. Everyone except the truth itself. Greek authorities launched one of the largest manhunts the country had seen in years. Officers worked around the clock. They combed through CCTV footage, analyzed doorbell cameras, and compiled lists of known burglars operating in Athens. A reward was announced, large enough to make headlines. Airports were monitored. Border crossings were tightened. Detectives interrogated suspects day and night. The story spread across Europe. Journalists reported from outside the couple's home. International outlets called the crime unthinkable. And through it all, Babis appeared on television, holding his infant daughter, thanking the public for their love and support. To everyone watching, he looked like a devastated husband. A man surviving the unimaginable. A man the nation admired for his courage. But behind the scenes, something didn't add up. There were gaps in the timeline. Inconsistencies in Babis's statements. And forensic clues that whispered a different story. Investigators didn't have proof yet. But they had a feeling, a quiet intuition that something about this tragedy wasn't what it seemed. This is where the story begins to shift. Where facts come into conflict with emotion. Where evidence challenges grief. And where the picture of a perfect marriage begins to crack. Because as investigators dug deeper into the couple's private life, they uncovered something unexpected, a hidden world of arguments, fear, and escalating tension behind closed doors. A world Caroline documented in her diary. A world her friends quietly suspected. A world her family worried about. A world the public knew nothing about, until now. And once detectives uncovered the truth, the illusion would collapse. The deception would unravel. And the man the world believed, would become the prime suspect. Before the headlines, before the tragedy, before the world knew her name, Caroline Crouch was simply a young girl growing up on an island that felt untouched by time. Her childhood unfolded on Alonissos, one of Greece's quiet gems. Here, the air smelled of salt, the days were warm, and the nights calm. Caroline's parents, a British father and Filipina mother, had chosen the island not for luxury, but for peace. They believed it would be the perfect place to raise a family. And in many ways, it was. Caroline grew up climbing rocks, exploring beaches, and spending hours in the water. She was bold, adventurous, unafraid of challenges. Teachers described her as bright. Friends described her as loyal. Her parents described her as a light in every room. She loved animals. She loved photography. And she loved the sensation of freedom that came with diving beneath the surface of the sea, her escape, her sanctuary. No one could have imagined that this same girl, raised in tranquility, would one day become the center of one of Greece's most shocking modern tragedies. Caroline first encountered Babis Anagnostopoulos during a Good Friday event on the island. She was a teenager, still forming her world. He was nearly 12 years older, established, charming, and deliberate. Babis carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he understood life. He talked about aviation, his career, and his ambitions. To a young girl, the image was powerful. To Caroline, it felt like stepping into an exciting world far bigger than her own. He courted her attention carefully. Patiently. Strategically. He spent time on the island more frequently. He made himself visible to her school, her friends, her family. And slowly, subtly, Caroline began to see him as someone extraordinary. What Caroline didn't know was that this first encounter would set in motion a future filled with emotional complexity, one she couldn't fully understand at the time. When they officially became a couple, people noticed the age difference, but Caroline defended her relationship fiercely. She believed she had found someone who loved her deeply, someone who would protect her. But experts in relational psychology later noted several early patterns that often appear in relationships marked by imbalance. Isolation disguised as romance. Dependence disguised as devotion. Control disguised as care. Babis was older, more experienced, and financially stable. Caroline was young, impressionable, and eager to build a life different from the one she knew. Over time, he positioned himself as the center of her world. Not through force, but through subtle emotional shaping. He encouraged her to leave behind the island. He became her primary source of emotional validation. He framed disagreements as misunderstandings she caused. And, according to her diary, he frequently made her feel guilty for wanting independence. To the outside world, this looked like an intense, passionate bond. But internally, it was shifting the balance of power in ways Caroline could not yet see. In mid-July of the year 2019, the couple eloped in Portugal. It was not the lively, traditional wedding Caroline's parents had imagined for their daughter. Nor did it reflect the vibrant celebrations typical of Greek families. It was small. Quiet. Without the people who had raised her. Caroline accepted this as romantic. A secret shared between lovers. But later, investigators and psychologists described it differently. Isolating a partner from their support system, even subtly, can give one person significant emotional influence over the other. When the newlyweds returned to Athens, that influence only grew stronger. Caroline was far from her childhood home, adjusting to a new city, a new lifestyle, and soon after, a new role as a mother. Caroline began attending university. Babis continued flying. Their social media pages sparkled with happiness, sunlit photos, smiling selfies, vacation moments. But private life was different. Caroline's diary, which she kept meticulously, revealed recurring struggles. Arguments that left her feeling overwhelmed. Moments where she felt emotionally dismissed. Times she wanted to leave but felt she couldn't. Increasing anxiety about the future. She wrote about wanting to return to Alonissos. She wrote about missing her family. She wrote about feeling like she didn't have control over her own life. Her words were tender, confused, and deeply human. For a young woman who once thrived in freedom, her new life felt increasingly confined. But to the outside world, everything looked perfect. That contrast would later become crucial in understanding what truly happened. When Caroline became pregnant, she was thrilled. She looked forward to motherhood, to building a home filled with love. But she also expressed fear in her writing, fear that the baby would tie her permanently to a relationship she wasn't sure she wanted anymore. She wrote about love, but also about doubt. She wrote about loyalty, but also about feeling trapped. After giving birth in midsummer of 2020, the emotional distance between the couple grew. Caroline struggled with the demands of new motherhood. Babis struggled with Caroline's emotional fluctuations. Arguments became more frequent. And, as her diary entries showed, Caroline increasingly felt unheard. Yet despite the tension, she adored her daughter more than anything. She wanted to be a good mother. She wanted to provide a stable home. It was this desire, the desire for stability for her child, that kept her in the relationship far longer than she believed she should have stayed. By early spring of 2021, family members and close friends sensed something was off. Caroline seemed more tired than usual, more withdrawn, more anxious around conflict, more attached to her baby than to her husband. Her messages to friends became fragmented, emotional, ambivalent. One moment she expressed love for Babis. The next, she said she wanted to leave. Her diary confirmed this inner conflict. She wrote, "I love him, but this relationship hurts me. Sometimes I want to go, but I don't know how." Those words would later send chills through investigators. In the days leading up to the incident, Caroline and Babis had been discussing life plans, including buying land to build their dream home. Her parents gifted her money toward this future. But behind that hopeful picture, tensions brewed. Phone records showed arguments. Messages showed emotional distance. Her diary showed a growing belief that she needed to create space between herself and her husband. In fact, on the night she lost her life, investigators later discovered that Caroline had attempted to search for a hotel, a place she could take her daughter and stay temporarily. This detail alone reframed the entire narrative. She was preparing to leave. She was preparing for change. She was preparing to reclaim her life. But she never got the chance. In the hours before the tragedy, neighbors heard something unusual, not the sounds of a house being torn apart, not the chaos described in the initial report, but something softer. Something unsettling in its quietness. A sound described as a distressed animal. Short. Sharp. Troubling. No loud crashes. No shouts. No break-in noises. Just a quiet disturbance that would later contradict nearly every detail of the story the husband told police. And this was only the beginning. Because as investigators began piecing together the timeline, the illusion of a robbery would soon collapse. Behind the scenes, detectives were beginning to notice small but significant inconsistencies. The time stamps didn't align. The physical evidence didn't match the narrative. Certain claims contradicted forensic data. Security systems showed unexpected activity. They didn't speak publicly yet. They didn't accuse anyone. They simply watched. Listened. Measured. Waited. And as more details emerged, their quiet suspicion began to grow. The truth was beginning to reveal itself, not through dramatic discoveries, but through subtle signs, inconsistencies, and the quiet voice of evidence that never lies. As days passed after Caroline's death, the story consumed Greece. Every television channel replayed coverage. Every newspaper printed new theories. Every online forum buzzed with speculation. People in cafes whispered about it. Taxi drivers discussed it. Families around dinner tables tried to make sense of it. The idea of intruders committing such a heartless crime in a quiet suburb shook the country. The public wanted answers, immediate ones. But behind the scenes, investigators faced something far more challenging than the public realized. Not because of a lack of evidence, but because the evidence whispered a truth very different from the one the world believed. The Greek police were under intense scrutiny. They were expected to solve the case quickly. They were expected to restore a sense of safety. They were expected to hunt down what many believed was a dangerous gang. And so, they moved fast. Teams searched nearby neighborhoods, looking for anything that resembled the description the husband provided. Roadblocks were set up. Border authorities were alerted. Interpol was notified. At the same time, forensic experts examined every inch of the couple's home. But strangely, they found almost nothing. No fingerprints. No shoe prints. No foreign DNA. No signs of forced entry consistent with the story given. The absence of evidence was unusual. Too clean for a violent break-in. Too controlled for a chaotic robbery. It wasn't what they expected to see, but publicly, they remained composed. The husband, after all, appeared devastated. And grief has a way of overpowering suspicion. For now. The investigation took a dramatic turn when officers detained a man near the border of northeastern Greece. The man was holding a passport that turned out to be fake. He had injuries that raised questions. He had a record that made investigators wary. And he had a history of committing robberies, some of them disturbingly similar to what had allegedly happened to Caroline. His name was Georgi H., a Georgian national with a long criminal past. Immediately, whispers filled the media, they caught him. This must be one of the intruders. The case is practically solved. People wanted closure. People wanted justice. People wanted the nightmare to be over. But nothing is ever that simple in a story built on deception. The man was interrogated for days. Detectives asked about his whereabouts. His associates. His movements on the night of the crime. And though he had been involved in break-ins around Athens, none of the evidence linked him to the couple's home. There was no DNA match. No witness match. No physical trace. No confession, not even under pressure. He denied knowing Caroline. He denied being near the house. And forensic analysis supported his claims. Eventually, investigators had no choice but to release him from suspicion. And this moment, this turning point, shook the police internally. If the crime had truly been committed by professional burglars, why was there still no trace? No lead? No movement on the case? Something wasn't adding up. Something was off. Very off. Meanwhile, the media continued to portray the husband as a grieving father and a tragic survivor of an unthinkable event. He attended memorials. He gave interviews. He thanked the public for their support. He held his daughter and spoke softly about loss. He cried on camera. To the average viewer, he seemed genuine, a man broken by tragedy. Social media embraced him. Articles praised his strength. People reached out with condolences. But behind the scenes, detectives were becoming increasingly uneasy. There were too many coincidences. Too many convenient details. Too many inconsistencies in his statements. And little by little, the foundation of his story began to crumble. One of the earliest strange clues came from something incredibly simple. The window. According to the husband, intruders entered through a small basement window after removing the locking pins. But when crime scene analysts examined it, they realized something impossible. The window was too narrow for anyone of adult build to climb through. Not even someone small-framed could have easily maneuvered through it, especially not quickly, silently, or without leaving marks. Investigators quietly remeasured. Tested various positions. Checked for fingerprints. Nothing. Impossible. Illogical. If the intruders didn't use the window, how did they enter the home? This was the first moment investigators began to suspect the story was staged. They didn't accuse the husband. But the doubt had begun. Neighbors living around the home were interviewed repeatedly. Their statements shared one detail in common. No one heard loud noises. No one heard shouting. No one heard a break-in. No one heard alarms. No one heard chaos, just the sound of an animal in distress. But a violent robbery? In the middle of the night? With drawers being ripped open? Furniture being overturned? Something should have been heard. But nothing was. The silence was unsettling. It contradicted the husband's description of a chaotic attack. The more quietly the scene appeared, the louder the questions became. The house had a security camera installed in the living room, a small device positioned to monitor the interior. According to the husband, the so-called intruders had ripped it from the wall and removed its memory card during the robbery. But forensic analysis revealed something shocking. The memory card had been removed hours before the husband claimed intruders entered the home. Not at 4 in the morning. Not during the supposed struggle. Not by unknown criminals. But earlier. Much earlier. This discovery set off alarm bells inside the investigation. If the memory card was taken out long before the alleged break-in, who removed it? And why? For detectives, this was no longer a case of missing information. It was a case with deliberately altered information. And that changes everything. Digital forensics often tells the truth when people cannot, or will not. Caroline wore a smartwatch capable of tracking her heart rate. Babis wore a fitness tracker that monitored his movements. Both devices silently recorded data that would later expose the truth. When investigators examined this data, they uncovered contradictions so significant that the entire story of the home invasion began to collapse. Caroline's heart rate patterns showed. She was asleep shortly before 4 in the morning. Her pulse spiked sharply a few minutes later, indicating emotional shock or physical struggle. Her reading stopped entirely before the time the husband claimed the intruders attacked. Babis's data showed movement during the period he said he was tied up and unconscious. The timeline didn't match his claims. Not by minutes, but by entire sequences of events. The data didn't lie. It couldn't lie. And now, the investigators had their first truly hard evidence that something was wrong. Despite the house appearing ransacked, the level of disarray didn't match what experienced criminals typically do during a rushed robbery. Drawers were pulled out, but items were placed oddly. Furniture was shifted, but not naturally. The mess appeared deliberately staged. Artificial. Contrived. Detectives noted. No fingerprints or smudges on key surfaces. No dirt or shoe marks from outside. No trace DNA from additional individuals. No fibers out of place except those belonging to the family. If a group of robbers had truly moved through the house, there would have been chaos. There would have been noise. There would have been trace evidence. But there wasn't. Every detail added up to one conclusion: the scene looked performed rather than lived. Even with growing suspicions, investigators moved slowly. Methodically. Carefully. They watched Babis's interviews. They analyzed his statements. They compared his retellings. They studied his emotional responses. He was consistent. Almost too consistent. His grief seemed perfect. His story seemed polished. His timing seemed practiced. But experienced detectives know that rehearsed grief carries a different tone than genuine devastation. They noticed subtle inconsistencies, small details most people would never pick up on. Yet the public still believed him. And the pressure to solve the case weighed heavily on the police. They needed undeniable proof, not intuition. Not suspicion. Not possibilities. But something solid. Something impossible to refute. And soon, they would get exactly that. For more than a month, investigators had searched for a gang that did not exist. They had interviewed dozens of suspects. They had monitored borders. They had combed through hours of surveillance footage. They had followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. But now, the clues were pointing inward. Into the home. Into the marriage. Into the private world that only Caroline could describe, and she had. In her diary. A journal filled with hopes, fears, frustrations, and confessions. Written not for the world, not for investigators, but for herself, a young woman trying to make sense of a complicated love story that had slowly transformed into something darker. And in the pages of that diary, Caroline had already told the truth. Caroline's diary had been inside the home during the incident. At first, investigators catalogued it as evidence but didn't analyze it deeply. But once the timeline discrepancies surfaced, once the forensic inconsistencies grew impossible to ignore, they returned to her writings with renewed attention. The journal was bound in simple fabric. Soft. Worn from constant use. Filled with entries spanning years. Inside those pages lay dreams. Arguments. Confessions. Pleas. Doubts. And, ultimately, fear. It was not a diary filled with dramatic language, just the honest expressions of a young woman trying to navigate adulthood, motherhood, and a marriage that felt increasingly unstable. Caroline's voice, preserved in ink, would become the single most powerful witness in the case. A witness who could not be intimidated, or manipulated, or silenced. Investigators read the diary slowly and carefully. Her early entries were hopeful. She believed deeply in love. She wanted a family. She adored her daughter. She tried, again and again, to make the relationship work. But as the months passed, her entries began to change in tone. She wrote about arguments. She wrote about feeling emotionally isolated. She wrote about wanting to leave. She wrote about fear, not constant, but persistent enough to trouble her. One entry described her crying alone after a fight. Another described taking the baby and leaving the house briefly. Another described feeling suffocated by the relationship's intensity. But one particular entry sent a chill through investigators. Sometimes I want to go, but I feel I can't. Not yet. Not while everything is so fragile. Those words, simple, emotional, quiet, reframed the situation entirely. Caroline had not been living a perfect love story. She had been living a private struggle that few knew existed. The last entry was heartbreaking in its simplicity. She wrote about feeling overwhelmed. She wrote about wanting separation. She wrote about needing space for her mental health. She wrote about wanting a place to stay with her daughter, temporarily. Experts later described it as a classic sign of emotional exhaustion. A final attempt to regain control of her life. The timing of this entry was crucial, written shortly before she lost her life. Investigators now had a mismatched physical timeline. Digital data contradicting the original story. A diary documenting distress. Forensic clues of staging. And a victim preparing to leave her marriage. The pieces were aligning. The focus of the investigation shifted fully. And from this moment forward, the primary suspect was no longer outside the home. The primary suspect was inside it. Behind closed doors, a small group of detectives began treating the case as a domestic incident rather than a robbery. But they moved carefully. They understood the media saw Babis as a grieving hero. They understood the public adored him. They understood premature accusations could damage the entire investigation. So they did something rare in modern policing. They watched, silently. They watched his interviews. They watched his facial expressions. They watched how he held his daughter. They watched how he described the night. They watched the order of his memories. They watched how often he repeated certain statements. They watched how he responded to sympathy, versus skepticism. And they waited for the perfect moment to act. Because a case like this cannot be solved with assumptions. It must be solved with timing, patience, and undeniable truth. On the 17th day of June, just over a month after Caroline's death, a small memorial service was held on Alonissos, the island where she grew up. Her parents attended. Her childhood friends attended. People from the community gathered to pay respects to the girl they had once watched swim freely in turquoise waters. And Babis attended too. He stood near the family. He whispered condolences. He embraced people who offered sympathy. He carried their daughter, the child now left without a mother. To everyone present, he looked composed, grief-stricken but strong. But investigators had chosen this moment for a very specific reason. They were about to confront him. Two detectives arrived quietly on the island, dressed in plain clothing to avoid attention. They did not interfere with the service. They waited, observing, patient. When the final prayers were spoken, when candles were extinguished, when the crowd began to disperse, the detectives walked toward Babis. They spoke softly, respectfully, professionally. They told him they had a new lead. They said they needed his help to identify a suspect. They asked him to accompany them to Athens. He agreed immediately. Why wouldn't he? He had nothing to fear, or so he thought. But this was not a request. This was the beginning of the end. Babis was escorted off the island in a police helicopter, the same type of aircraft he used to fly for a living. The symbolism did not go unnoticed. Investigators described him as calm, even talkative. He asked routine questions. He never appeared nervous. But detectives were not looking at his behavior alone. They were looking for micro-expressions. Tiny shifts in the eyes, brief muscle contractions, subtle changes in breathing. Signs the human body gives away even when the mind tries to stay composed. And during that flight, they saw the first flicker of concern. A subtle change. A tightening of the jaw. A glance toward the floor. It wasn't fear of a suspect. It was fear of the truth. When they landed in Athens, detectives escorted him straight to the homicide division. Still, they treated him gently. Still, they spoke with empathy. Still, they acted as though he were a victim, not a suspect. And then, once he was seated, they placed the evidence on the table. Not all at once. Not in dramatic fashion. Piece by piece. The data from the smartwatch. The timeline from the fitness tracker. The inconsistencies in the break-in story. The forensic analysis of the window. The security camera data. The diary entries. The hotel search on Caroline's phone. Babis remained silent. Then he asked questions. Then he denied inconsistencies. Then he tried to re-explain timelines. But investigators were no longer listening to explanations. They were listening to tone. To hesitation. To the growing crack in his composure. And finally, after hours of questioning, the pressure broke through. He leaned back. He exhaled deeply. And he whispered something investigators would never forget. Something that changed the entire direction of the case. He began to confess, not fully, not truthfully, not at first. He shifted blame. He framed the argument as mutual. He described losing control. He described acting out of emotion. But as hours passed, the story slowly transformed into what investigators already suspected. He admitted there was no robbery. He admitted there were no intruders. He admitted he staged the scene. He admitted he tried to mislead the country. And he admitted he had been untruthful from the very beginning. With each word, the illusion crumbled. With each detail, the truth surfaced. With each sentence, the story the world believed fell apart. The case that shocked the nation had never been a robbery at all. It had been something far closer to home. And now, the world would soon learn the truth. Inside the interrogation room, time felt suspended. The investigators sat quietly, letting the silence settle. Babis stared at the floor, his hands trembling slightly. He had confessed, but the confession was fragmented, incomplete, coated in excuses. He spoke of emotion. Of confusion. Of panic. Of losing control. But the investigators weren't searching for emotion. They were searching for facts, the truth beneath the performance. Slowly, they guided him through the night step by step. And with each question, the facade weakened. Until finally, he admitted that the robbery had been staged. No masked intruders. No gang. No violent break-in. Just one man, constructing a lie he believed he could sell to the world. What had once been a fairy tale romance, had become a carefully scripted deception. A deception that fooled not only investigators, but an entire nation. Once investigators had Babis's partial confession, they connected it with the physical, digital, and behavioral evidence. Piece by piece, the true timeline of the night emerged. The early hours. Sometime before dawn, an argument erupted between the couple, one of many from the prior months. But this one escalated differently. Digital activity from Caroline's smartwatch suddenly changed at a specific minute, showing a sharp spike in heart rate, followed by an abrupt stop. This data alone contradicted the original story. The cover-up. After the tragedy, Babis moved with chilling efficiency. He removed the memory card from the security camera. He staged the home to look ransacked. He tied himself up using items from the house. He attempted to create the appearance of a struggle. He positioned their baby in the bedroom. And then, he called the police with his nose, a detail he repeated in interviews. Every step was designed to portray him as a helpless victim. But digital data betrayed him. And his own confession filled in the missing pieces. It was no longer a question of if he had staged the scene. It was now a matter of why. News of his confession spread across Greece at lightning speed. People who had once comforted him felt stunned. Journalists who had praised his bravery felt deceived. Neighbors who embraced him felt manipulated. Citizens who feared a violent gang felt misled. Television shows cut into live programming. Radio hosts voiced disbelief. Social media erupted. For weeks, Greece had mourned with him. For weeks, he had been the symbol of undeserved suffering. For weeks, the nation had carried his story in collective grief. And now the truth. It hit like a wave. The man who cried on camera. The man who held his infant during interviews. The man who stood before a gravestone and paid tribute to his wife. Had been performing. Not grieving. Not mourning. Performing. When authorities informed Caroline's parents of the confession, their world cracked open again. They had believed their daughter was the victim of a senseless crime committed by strangers. But now, the truth was infinitely more painful. Her father, known for his quiet strength, struggled to contain his disbelief. Her mother, devastated, realized the person she had once trusted with her daughter's happiness had been the cause of her suffering. Caroline's parents had welcomed Babis into their home. They had supported their daughter's marriage. They had trusted him. And he had betrayed them all. One news outlet reported that her father said, "He fooled everyone. But not forever." For parents, there is no pain deeper than losing a child, except learning that the loss came from the person she once loved. For the first time since the tragedy, investigators held a press briefing. They explained the digital timeline, the smartwatch evidence, the forensic inconsistencies, the staged crime scene, the absence of intruder DNA, the contradictions in Babis's statements. What struck the public most was not the complexity of the investigation, but how carefully the truth had been hidden. His performance had been convincing. His story emotional. His interviews heartfelt. But investigators emphasized something profound. Evidence does not lie. Not heart rate patterns. Not device movement tracking. Not memory card data. Not micro-expressions. Not timelines. Science had uncovered the truth long before he confessed. Following the interrogation, Babis was formally arrested and charged. The public watched footage of him being escorted into custody. No tears. No statements. No theatrics. The performance was over. He was transferred to a correctional facility where he would await trial. For the first time since the incident, he no longer controlled the narrative. Detectives later said he was calm during intake, almost resigned. The illusion had collapsed. There was nothing left to maintain. Once a man believed to be a heartbroken husband, was now the central figure in a tragedy far darker than anyone imagined. After the arrest, the authorities publicly confirmed that Caroline's diary entries played a crucial role in understanding her emotional state. They did not release every page nor every detail, both out of respect and ethical responsibility. But they confirmed what many feared. Caroline had been trying to leave. She had been emotionally overwhelmed. She had been planning an exit, one that was interrupted. Experts in emotional abuse pointed to clear patterns of control, isolation, power imbalance, manipulation. Principles often present long before tragedy strikes. Her diary became her voice in death, a voice that could no longer be silenced by the person who once claimed to love her. Her words, written in private moments, would ultimately rewrite the story he tried to tell. In the aftermath, Greece found itself grappling with difficult questions. How did so many believe the lie? How did the staged crime seem so real? How did one man manipulate an entire nation's sympathy? What made the deception so effective? Sociologists later explained. The age difference created a false sense of authority. The public narrative of a home invasion matched existing fears. His calm, articulate public appearances won trust. People naturally sympathize with grieving parents. The crime seemed too extreme to imagine being staged. In other words, the lie worked because it fit the world's assumptions. Investigators later released a reconstructed version of what they believed happened. There were no intruders. The timeline he provided was manufactured. He staged the home after the tragedy. He tied himself with items from inside the house. The baby had been present but not harmed. The robbery signs were inconsistent and artificial. The emotional interviews were part of the deception. It wasn't a rushed or panicked crime scene. It was meticulously orchestrated. A staged story designed to mislead family, police, and the entire world. What made this case extraordinary was not only the crime itself, but the almost cinematic level of deception that followed. It was, in every sense, the murder that fooled the world. As the case moved toward trial, the world watched closely. Would he attempt a new story? Would he express remorse? Would he face the full weight of the law? His lawyers prepared their arguments. Caroline's family prepared themselves for painful testimony. The public prepared for answers. And in the center of it all, an infant child, too young to understand what had happened, remained in the care of loving relatives, unaware that her life had been changed forever. But the truth was no longer in question. The lies had been exposed. The illusion was broken. And justice was finally moving forward. By the time the trial began, months had passed since the confession, months filled with grief, public anger, and relentless media coverage. But now, everything would come to a head. The courthouse in Athens was surrounded by reporters. Camera flashes lit the stone steps. Broadcasters stood in clusters, waiting for updates. Pedestrians gathered behind barricades just to witness history. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted justice. Everyone wanted closure. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with emotion. Caroline's family sat quietly, holding hands, their eyes reflecting both sorrow and resolve. Across the aisle, Babis entered with a calmness that unsettled many, an eerie stillness that psychologists later called detached composure. This was not just another criminal trial. It had become a national reckoning, a search for truth after weeks of deception. The prosecutors began by presenting the digital evidence. They showed Caroline's heart rate spike recorded shortly after 4 in the morning. Her sudden lack of movement moments later. The fitness data showing Babis walking through the house when he claimed to be tied up. The exact timestamp of the memory card being removed. The lack of outside DNA or intruder traces. Each piece of evidence was straightforward. Each piece eliminated doubt. Each piece tightened the frame around one conclusion. Then came the diary. A female prosecutor read selected entries aloud, carefully, respectfully, choosing only the passages relevant to establishing emotional context. Entries about feeling trapped, wanting space, arguments, uncertainty, the emotional strain of the relationship. As her words echoed through the courtroom, the reality of Caroline's suffering settled over everyone present. Even those who had once defended the husband began to shift uneasily. Caroline's voice filled the silence, and in that silence, the truth gained strength. The defense argued that the incident had not been premeditated, that it had occurred during an emotional breakdown. They painted a picture of a man overwhelmed by stress, sleep deprivation, and parental tension. Their argument centered on emotional instability, a moment of panic, an inability to think clearly, regret immediately after. But the prosecution responded swiftly. If it were truly a moment of panic, why stage a crime scene? Why destroy a camera? Why bind himself? Why mislead the country for weeks? Why attend memorials while hiding the truth? The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor spoke. Panic does not produce deception of this magnitude. Planning does. The court enlisted forensic psychologists to evaluate his mental and emotional state. Their findings were detailed, but one theme came through clearly. They described traits such as a strong need for control, emotional dominance in relationships, manipulative tendencies, a calculated calmness when under scrutiny, ability to compartmentalize emotions. These traits, they explained, allowed him to maintain composure during interviews, perform grief convincingly, sustain a month-long deception, strategically stage a crime scene, adjust his narrative to public expectations. The psychologists didn't describe a man overwhelmed by panic. They described a man capable of orchestrating an elaborate illusion. When Caroline's father entered the courtroom, the entire room fell silent. He spoke not with anger but with profound sorrow. He described Caroline as bright, determined, loving, independent, full of life. He said he had trusted Babis. He said he believed his daughter was safe. He said he never imagined this outcome. His voice broke only once, when he spoke of the infant daughter now growing up without her mother. The courtroom held its breath. Caroline's mother was too emotional to speak publicly, but her written statement was read aloud. Her words painted a portrait of love, loss, and a wound that could never fully heal. Through their grief, they showed strength, a strength that anchored the entire trial. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily. Some held photos of Caroline. Some carried signs demanding justice. Some simply stood silently, waiting. The nation that had once embraced Babis now rejected him. People felt betrayed, not just by the crime, but by the lie. How could he deceive all of us? Why did we believe him? How did no one see through it? These questions echoed across talk shows, social media, and families across Greece. The trial was more than a legal process. It was a collective processing of grief and disbelief. When Babis finally addressed the court, he did not deny responsibility. He expressed regret. He blamed emotional distress. He repeated that he lost control. He apologized to the family. He said he never intended the worst outcome. But the prosecution countered with a single, haunting truth. Intentions are not measured by words after the fact. Intentions are measured by actions before and after. And his actions, especially after, portrayed not panic but calculation. His statements, while emotional, could not rewrite the timeline. Sometimes words can move hearts, but in a courtroom, facts move justice. After weeks of testimony, after forensic analysis, after psychological evaluations, after emotional statements, the judges withdrew to deliberate. Hours passed. The courtroom waited. The country waited. Caroline's family waited. And finally, the judges returned. The room fell silent. The verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of ending a life. Guilty of staging a crime. Guilty of misleading authorities. Guilty of fabricating a story that terrified a nation. The courtroom reacted with a mix of relief and heavy emotion. Caroline's family embraced. Observers wiped tears. Reporters scribbled frantically. And Babis stood still, expressionless, quiet, resigned. During sentencing, the court considered the gravity of the crime, the deception that followed, the emotional impact on the community, the psychological profile, the orphan child left behind. The judge delivered a severe sentence, reflecting the calculated nature of the act and the elaborate cover-up that followed. The court's message was clear. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a moment of panic. This was a deliberate deception. Justice demanded accountability. Today, Caroline's memory lives on in the hearts of her family and the island community that raised her. Her story became a symbol of the importance of listening to victims, the hidden complexity behind relationships, the power of digital forensics, the way truth eventually surfaces, the strength of families seeking justice. Her diary, once a private refuge of her thoughts, became her voice, a voice that brought justice when she could no longer speak for herself. In the end, the truth prevailed. The deception collapsed. Justice was served. And though Caroline's story ended far too soon, her legacy continues, reminding the world that even the most elaborate illusions eventually shatter in the light of truth. When the verdict was announced, Greece exhaled, not in celebration, but in exhausted relief. The lie had been exposed. The staged narrative dismantled. The truth finally spoken out loud. But justice, even when delivered, does not erase grief. It does not restore what was lost. It does not mend the fractures left behind. In homes across Greece, people talked about the case long after the cameras left the courthouse. They spoke about the deception. They spoke about emotional control. They spoke about the quiet warning signs hidden behind perfect photographs. And many asked themselves a haunting question. How many other stories look perfect from the outside, but aren't? At the center of this tragedy was an infant girl, too young to speak, too young to understand, too young to know the world she was born into had changed forever. After the conviction, she was placed in the loving care of Caroline's family. Her grandparents welcomed her into their home, the same home where Caroline once laughed, learned, and dreamed about a future she'd never see. They promised to raise her with gentleness. They promised to tell her about her mother, not the tragedy, but the woman she was. Brave. Loving. Curious. Strong. A girl with sunlit afternoons and salt water in her hair. Her daughter will grow up surrounded by truth, not the illusion that once fooled the world. And perhaps that is the most important justice that remains. After the trial, legal experts, psychologists, and criminologists reflected on the lessons hidden within the case. 1. Digital evidence never lies. The smartwatch and phone data were crucial. They provided an unbiased timeline, free from emotion, free from manipulation. Experts now refer to this case as a landmark moment in digital forensics across Europe. 2. Hidden relationship dynamics matter. Psychologists highlighted the importance of recognizing emotional manipulation, isolation, sudden shifts in behavior, control disguised as care. Patterns that may not look dangerous at first, until they become impossible to ignore. 3. The power of public perception. For weeks, the entire country believed the story of a grieving husband. It was a painful reminder that public narratives can be misleading, especially when crafted by someone skilled in emotional performance. 4. The strength of victims' voices. Caroline's diary was not only evidence, it was her truth. Her voice. Her perspective. And in this case, it became a force that outlived her. Her words carried the weight of the truth, a truth that could not be silenced or rewritten. The case had a profound effect on Greece. Law enforcement agencies re-evaluated investigative protocols, particularly in cases involving domestic tension. Advocacy groups renewed campaigns about emotional and psychological abuse. The public began discussing warning signs more openly. For the first time in years, conversations about hidden suffering, especially within relationships, reached national urgency. Schools, community centers, and social groups began creating safe spaces for young people to talk about emotional safety, healthy relationships, independence, recognizing controlling behavior, asking for help. It didn't undo the tragedy, but it changed the landscape of awareness. This, too, became part of Caroline's legacy. With time, more details of the case were shared publicly, not to sensationalize, but to educate. Police described the unusual calmness of the staged crime scene. Technicians explained the digital timestamps. Forensic analysts spoke about the importance of paying attention to what wasn't found at the scene. And in academic circles, Caroline's case became a study of behavioral deception, long-term manipulation, staged criminal events, the limits and breakthroughs of forensic evidence. Her story, heartbreaking as it was, became a tool for preventing future tragedies. As time passed, the world did not forget Caroline. Her story continued to be shared, not because of how she died, but because of who she was while she lived. A bright student. A devoted mother. A young woman searching for happiness. A soul who deserved peace. On her home island of Alonissos, her memory lives quietly, gently. Residents speak of her with tenderness. Her friends visit the places she once loved. Her family keeps her memory alive for her daughter, showing her photos, telling her stories, and raising her with the love Caroline would have given. And every year, when people gather to honor her, the same message echoes. Her truth survived. Her voice was heard. Her story mattered. In the end, this is more than a case. More than a trial. More than a crime that fooled the world. This is the story of a young woman whose truth endured, a truth preserved in her words, her courage, and the memories of those who loved her. Her legacy reminds us that behind every photograph, every smile, every perfect moment, there can be a deeper story waiting to be heard. And sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is listen. You have been watching Buried Secret Media. If Caroline's story moved you, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing the stories that deserve to be seen, and the voices that must never be forgotten.